The air was thick with tension. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the elderly man struggle with the heavy bags of groceries in his hands, teetering dangerously on the edge of the sidewalk. Her thoughts raced. The neighborhood had been quiet lately, and the last thing she needed was someone getting hurt right in front of her apartment. "Here, let me help you with that," Sarah said, rushing forward and reaching out to steady the man, gently taking the bags from his frail hands. She couldn't ignore the guilt that washed over her. She had been so wrapped up in her own worries, the looming trial, the money problems, the tension between her and Jason, her husband, that she almost walked past him without noticing. The elderly man gave her a slow, grateful smile. "Thank you. Young lady, it's hard to get these things home alone at my age." "No problem," she replied, offering a soft smile of her own. "Let me walk you to your door." They walked in silence, Sarah scanning the street nervously, her mind still on Jason and the upcoming court case. The trial was only 2 days away. Jason's fate hung in the balance, and she could barely breathe knowing the outcome might destroy everything they had worked for. The weight of their financial struggles, the mounting pressure of the case, and the impending risk of losing their home kept gnawing at her. When they reached the man's small house, he turned to her, his face suddenly serious. "You've been very kind, young lady. You don't know how much it means to me." Sarah nodded, but before she could turn to leave, the man's voice stopped her. "I don't suppose you know who I am, do you?" She glanced at him, confused. "No, should I?" A small, knowing smile crossed his face. "I'm Judge Thomas Ellison." The name hit her like a punch to the stomach. Judge Thomas Ellison. He was one of the most respected judges in the city. A man known for being fair but also stern. The man who was about to preside over Jason's trial in 2 days. The man whose decision would determine whether Jason, her husband, would face years behind bars or be set free. If you enjoy tales like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. What will happen to Sarah's husband? What will the judge's reaction be? To know this, let's jump into this again. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Judge Thomas Ellison, the man who would decide Jason's fate. Sarah felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her pulse quickened, and the world around her seemed to blur, the sidewalk beneath her feet, turning into a faint, distant memory. This was too surreal to be real. How could the elderly man she had just helped be the same man who would preside over her husband's trial? The same man whose judgment could potentially tear her life apart. She had barely managed to process his name when the full weight of the situation hit her. Sarah's mind reeled with a flood of thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. She could hear the echo of his words in her mind, but they felt like they came from far away, as if she were caught in some kind of twisted dream. Judge Thomas Ellison. He was no ordinary judge. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose decisions shaped lives and whose rulings carried the kind of authority that made even the most hardened criminals pause. Yet here he was, the very person she had just assisted with something as mundane as carrying groceries. For a moment Sarah stood still, struggling to find her bearings. Could this really be happening? Could fate or some higher power have orchestrated this encounter? Was this just a coincidence, or was there a deeper meaning behind this strange twist of events? Her breath caught in her throat as she turned over the possibilities in her mind. "Judge Ellison," she whispered, almost to herself, as if saying the name aloud would help make sense of the chaos swirling in her thoughts. The elderly man seemed to sense her shock. His weathered face softened into a knowing smile, and he took a step closer, his gaze fixed on her. "I can see the surprise in your eyes, Mrs. Parker. It's not often that people realize who I am, unless they're involved in a case I'm overseeing." Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze. He wasn't just any judge. He was a figure that carried immense weight in the courtroom, a man known for his fairness, but also for his unyielding sense of justice. And more importantly, he was the judge who would decide Jason's fate. The thought of that sent a chill down her spine. How could the man who had just accepted her small act of kindness be the same person who held her husband's future in his hands? "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. Why didn't you say anything about being, well, the judge? Judge Ellison gave her a patient look, his expression calm but thoughtful. Because it wasn't necessary. Your kindness spoke for itself, Mrs. Parker. And frankly, it's rare to see someone help without expectation of something in return. That's why I decided to tell you who I am. The words settled in Sarah's mind, and she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope mixed with disbelief. She had always believed in the power of kindness, in the idea that doing the right thing, no matter how small, would be repaid one way or another. But now, standing in front of this man, she couldn't help but wonder if that belief might hold some weight. Was this some kind of divine intervention? A sign that her actions, the simple, selfless act of helping an elderly man, might have far-reaching consequences that could affect Jason's trial. Her thoughts turned to Jason. His trial was in 2 days, and the odds were stacked against him. The evidence seemed overwhelming, and the prosecution had an airtight case. But Jason's past wasn't all that defined him. He wasn't a bad person at his core. He had made mistakes, yes, some big ones, but Sarah believed in his potential for change. She knew the man he was when they first met, the man who had once filled her heart with hope and dreams for a better future. But over the years, the weight of his past had slowly eroded that promise, and now it threatened to destroy everything. As Sarah stared at Judge Ellison, she couldn't help but think that perhaps this chance encounter was more than just a fleeting moment. It felt as though the universe had conspired to bring them together. But what did it mean? Was it just a coincidence? Or was there some deeper meaning behind this strange turn of events? Could this brief moment of kindness, this simple, insignificant act, be the key to changing everything? "Why did you say that about kindness?" Sarah asked, still reeling from the news. "What do you mean it goes a long way? Do you really think that, I don't know, a small act like this could make a difference in something as big as my husband's trial?" Judge Ellison's eyes softened as he regarded her. He seemed to understand her confusion, and his voice was calm and measured as he spoke. "It's not always about the big gestures, Mrs. Parker. Sometimes it's the small everyday acts of kindness that can have the greatest impact. In my line of work, I see people who are quick to judge, quick to condemn, and quick to forget the power of compassion. But in your case, you've shown me something different. You've reminded me that there are still people out there who care, who act out of pure kindness without seeking anything in return." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she absorbed his words. She hadn't expected this conversation to take such a turn. A part of her had hoped that her act of kindness might somehow lead to something more, but now, hearing the weight of Judge Ellison's words, she felt both overwhelmed and encouraged. Could this be the moment that changed everything for Jason? Could this simple connection with the man who held her husband's fate in his hands be the turning point they so desperately needed? She didn't know, but as the conversation continued, a part of her began to believe it might just be possible. "You've given me something to think about," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought of it that way." Judge Ellison gave a small nod. "Sometimes it's the things we least expect that have the greatest power. Remember that, Mrs. Parker. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." With that, he turned and began walking towards his front door. Sarah remained where she was, standing at the edge of the sidewalk, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. She had no idea what would come next. But in that fleeting moment, she realized that perhaps her kindness had planted a seed, one that, if nurtured, might grow into something that could change everything. As she walked back toward her apartment, Sarah's thoughts remained with Judge Ellison. She couldn't help but wonder if this brief, unexpected encounter might turn out to be the most significant moment of her life. Would it be enough to alter the course of Jason's trial? Or was it just a momentary blip in an otherwise cruel and unyielding world? She didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things might work out after all. 2 days earlier, Sarah had received the letter from Jason's lawyer. The envelope, marked with the official seal of the law firm, sat on the kitchen counter for hours before she could bring herself to open it. The moment she did, the stark, black text on the white paper hit her like a wave crashing over her head. The charges against Jason were severe. She read through them once, twice, and then again, hoping she had missed something, but there was no denying it. Jason's future was hanging by a thread. Sarah had tried to prepare herself for this moment. She knew Jason had been walking a fine line for years, making reckless choices that had finally caught up with him. His debts, his troubled past, the bad decisions. They had all led to this point. But even with the warning signs, she still wasn't ready. No one could ever be ready for something like this. As Sarah held the letter in her trembling hands, the words blurred before her eyes. Charges, fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Each word felt like a dagger to her heart. They painted a picture of Jason as a man who had knowingly committed crimes, a criminal who had used his position to deceive and betray. But that wasn't the whole story. Sarah knew the man Jason was at his core, and she couldn't reconcile. This image of a hardened criminal with the man she had loved for years. She had met Jason in a much simpler time. He was full of hope and dreams. When they first met, he had been on the brink of launching his own business, a small startup that he was convinced would take off and solve all of their financial problems. He was optimistic, full of ideas and brimming with energy. The world had seemed so much brighter then, and Sarah had fallen in love with his passion. It was contagious. They were both young, both excited about the future, and the possibilities seemed endless. But life, as it often does, had a way of complicating things. When the business failed, the first crack appeared. The debt started to pile up. Jason took on more responsibility than he could handle, and his choices began to reflect the stress and desperation he felt. He started taking risks, some that paid off, but most that didn't. They both had their share of sleepless nights, worrying about money, about the future, and about how they would make it through. But even through all the hard times, Sarah had believed in Jason. She believed in the man he had been when they first met, the man who had worked tirelessly to provide for them, who had always been there for her when she needed him. She had never once doubted his love for her, but she had begun to question his judgment, his ability to make the right decisions. Now, as she looked at the letter, the reality of the situation was too much to bear. The evidence against Jason was overwhelming. Bank statements, forged documents, and wire transfers all pointed to a man who had taken advantage of the trust placed in him. He had stolen from his employer, manipulated financial records, and forged signatures. There was no way to sugarcoat it. The case against him was solid. The prosecution had a list of witnesses who would testify against him, each with their own damning account of Jason's involvement in the illegal activities. Sarah's mind spun. She had been trying so hard to keep her emotions in check, to stay strong for Jason. But the truth was, she didn't know how much longer she could keep it together. She felt like she was on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong move would send her tumbling into the abyss. The trial was only 2 days away, and the pressure was mounting. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything they had built together, everything they had fought for, was about to come crashing down. She had tried to talk to Jason about it, but he was a wreck. He had barely been able to hold it together, let alone face the reality of what was about to happen. He had always been proud, and asking for help had never come easily to him. He had a tendency to bottle up his emotions, and now it was like a dam had burst, and he didn't know how to handle the flood of feelings that came with it. "Sarah, I don't know what to do," Jason had confessed to her the night he received the letter. He had collapsed on the couch, his head in his hands. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I don't know how to fix it." Sarah had sat beside him, her own heart aching as she watched the man she loved break before her eyes. She had reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "We'll figure this out, Jason. We have to. You're not alone in this." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. The truth was, she had no idea how they would get through this. The financial strain, the mounting legal fees, the emotional toll, it all seemed too much. She didn't know where to begin. She had tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the trial, but she could never shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on them. In the days leading up to the trial, Sarah had spent hours researching everything she could about the legal process. She had contacted Jason's lawyer, a man named Mr. Patel, who had been handling the case with as much care as he could. He had explained the charges in detail, outlining the evidence against Jason and the potential consequences if he was convicted. The reality was grim, and Sarah couldn't escape the dread that settled in her chest every time she thought about the trial. Jason could be sentenced to years in prison if the jury found him guilty. The more Sarah learned, the more helpless she felt. She wasn't a legal expert, and no matter how much she wanted to fight for her husband, she knew that the outcome of the trial was out of her hands. She had prayed for some miracle, for something to intervene. But as the days passed, it became clearer and clearer that the case against Jason was airtight. The only thing they could do now was hope for a lenient sentence. But even that felt like a long shot. The night before the trial, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. The fear, the anxiety, the uncertainty, it was all too much to bear. She tried to think about the good things in their life, the moments of happiness they had shared, but those memories seemed so distant now. The future felt so uncertain, and she didn't know how to face it. In the quiet of the night, she found herself thinking about Judge Thomas Ellison again. The encounter earlier that day was still fresh in her mind. She had tried to push the thoughts aside to focus on the grim reality of the trial, but there was something about him, something about the way he had spoken to her, that gave her a glimmer of hope. Was it possible that his decision could be swayed by a simple act of kindness? Was there a chance, however small, that he might see the man Jason really was, not just the mistakes of his past, but the person he had become over the years? As the hours dragged on, Sarah made a silent vow to herself. She would do whatever it took to support Jason, no matter what happened in that courtroom. She couldn't change the past, and she couldn't undo the mistakes he had made. But she could stand by him now, in the face of the worst storm they had ever encountered. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The trial was only 2 days away, and the stakes had never been higher. But as Sarah lay there in the darkness, she found a sliver of strength deep within herself. She wasn't alone in this fight, and she wouldn't let go of the hope that somehow they could make it through this together. As Sarah walked back to her apartment, after her brief but intense encounter with Judge Ellison, the weight of the past few days continued to press down on her. The streets felt quieter than usual, and the soft hum of traffic seemed distant, as though she were moving through a dream. The encounter with Judge Ellison had left her with more questions than answers, and the uncertainty of it all hung like a cloud over her head. She couldn't shake the image of the elderly judge, his kind eyes staring back at her, with an understanding that both comforted and unsettled her. He had offered nothing but kindness, yet the knowledge that he was the one who would decide Jason's fate loomed over her like a dark shadow. Was it a sign, a twist of fate that somehow connected her in a way she couldn't yet comprehend? Or was it just an ordinary moment, a fleeting kindness between two strangers with no deeper meaning? Sarah tried to dismiss the thoughts as she reached her apartment building, but they persisted. She had too much on her mind to think clearly about anything else. The trial was only 2 days away, and every moment felt like a countdown to an inevitable explosion. Jason's trial was about to begin, and Sarah was terrified of what the outcome might be. The charges against him were serious, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The more she thought about it, the more she felt the ground beneath her feet slip away. Jason had been working late for the past few weeks, trying to catch up on the bills that seemed to multiply by the day. The mounting debts were taking their toll on both of them, and the stress was palpable. Every time Sarah tried to talk to him about the trial, about their future, he would shut down. His silence only made the situation worse, and the more he withdrew, the more Sarah felt herself drifting away from him as well. The gap between them, once filled with love and understanding, had become a chasm of fear, anger, and unspoken frustration. When she finally reached the apartment, she found herself standing in front of the door, unsure of what awaited her inside. Would Jason be home? Would he even speak to her? She had no idea. The last few weeks had been a blur of tension, arguments, and the silent understanding that both of them were drowning under the weight of their circumstances. But in the silence, Sarah also felt something deeper, a sense of isolation that was slowly suffocating her. She took a deep breath before pushing the door open. The apartment was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tightly against the outside world. It smelled faintly of leftover takeout and stale coffee, remnants of days that had passed in a haze of exhaustion and worry. The couch was empty, and the kitchen was silent. Jason wasn't home yet. Sarah dropped her keys onto the table with a soft clink, the sound too loud in the quiet apartment. She moved slowly into the living room, sinking into the couch, the weight of the day finally hitting her. Her hands trembled as she stared at the phone on the coffee table. She knew she should call Jason. She should check in, ask him how he was, feeling, ask him what was going through his mind, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. The silence between them had become too heavy, too suffocating. What was there to say anymore? Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Emily, her best friend, who had been trying to keep in touch throughout the chaos of the past few weeks. Emily had always been a steady presence in Sarah's life, offering advice and support when she needed it most. But tonight, Sarah couldn't bring herself to open the message. It felt like one more thing on her already overflowing plate, and she wasn't sure she could handle another conversation about Jason's trial, about their financial troubles, about the future. Instead, she picked up the remote and turned on the TV, the flickering screen offering a distraction from the mounting dread in her chest. But even the mindless chatter of the news anchors couldn't drown out the thoughts swirling in her head. How did everything go so wrong? How had Jason, the man she loved, ended up in this mess? He wasn't a bad person, she reminded herself. He had just made mistakes. Big ones. But didn't everyone? Didn't people deserve second chances? Couldn't Jason be one of the few who got that second chance? But in the back of her mind, doubt crept in. Maybe she was just fooling herself. Maybe Jason was just another man who had made choices that couldn't be undone, and now they both had to face the consequences. She thought about Judge Ellison again. She didn't know much about him beyond the little he had told her, but she had a nagging feeling that he was the key to everything. There was something in the way he had looked at her, the way he had spoken to her, that made her believe he was different from the other judges she had heard about. Maybe, just maybe, he was the kind of person who could see beyond the evidence, beyond the mistakes, and see the person underneath. Sarah shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She couldn't rely on some stranger's kindness to save Jason. She had to accept that the situation was out of her hands. There was nothing she could do except wait for the trial to begin, to sit in that cold courtroom and hope that the right decision would be made. But the fear of losing Jason, of losing everything, gnawed at her. The hours dragged on, and as the evening wore on, Sarah's exhaustion began to settle in. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with worries and what-ifs about the trial. She knew she needed to rest, to prepare for the days ahead. But every time she closed her eyes, the same image played in her mind. Jason, sitting in a courtroom, facing a jury, with his entire life hanging in the balance. She couldn't escape. The image, no matter how hard she tried. It was nearly midnight when Jason finally returned. The sound of the door opening broke through the haze of Sarah's thoughts. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what kind of mood he would be in, whether he would even acknowledge her presence. But when he stepped inside, she saw something she hadn't seen in days: exhaustion. His face was drawn, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes were vacant, as though he had been carrying the weight of the world on his back. "Hey," Sarah said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "How was your day?" Jason didn't respond right away. He kicked off his shoes and shuffled into the living room, dropping into the armchair across from the couch. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Sarah waited, holding her breath, unsure of what to do or say next. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can do this, Sarah," he said, his words heavy with a mix of frustration and despair. "This trial, this whole situation, it's eating me alive." The rawness in his voice broke something inside Sarah. She had always tried to be strong for him, to hold it all together, but hearing the pain in his voice made her own fears feel more real than ever. She reached out, her hand finding his, squeezing it gently. "We'll get through this," she said, though the words felt hollow. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. Jason turned his hand over, interlocking his fingers with hers. He didn't say anything in response, but the quiet weight of his hand in hers spoke volumes. They sat like that for a long time, the room filled only with the sound of their breathing, both of them caught in the silence of their shared uncertainty. "I don't know if I can face it, Sarah," Jason said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've made so many mistakes. I don't deserve a second chance." Sarah shook her head, her heart aching for him. "You do. You do deserve a second chance, Jason. You're not the person they're trying to make you out to be. You're more than your mistakes." Jason didn't respond, but for the first time in days, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they weren't completely alone in this. Maybe there was still a chance. Even in the darkest moments, there was always the possibility of redemption. As Sarah sat on the couch that evening, her eyes staring out of the window at the dimming sky, the quiet hum of the apartment felt deafening. The soft rustle of the leaves outside and the distant buzz of city traffic were like an alien soundtrack to her current state. The weight of everything, her worries about Jason, his impending trial, their crumbling finances, and the looming uncertainty of their future, seemed to press down on her chest like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Jason had always been her rock, the person she relied on through thick and thin. But tonight, as she sat in the silence of their apartment, she realized how much had changed. He was no longer the confident man she had fallen in love with. The man who once lit up a room with his smile, who could find humor even in the darkest of moments, was now a shadow of himself. He had become someone she barely recognized, someone who had retreated so far into himself that it felt like he was no longer a part of her world. It was hard to reconcile the man she knew with the man who had made the decisions that led them here, to this precipice where everything they had worked for could come crashing down. She remembered the first time she met Jason, the way his energy had filled the room, the spark in his eyes that made her believe that anything was possible. Back then, it seemed like they were on the brink of something great, like their future was a canvas waiting to be painted with their dreams. When they first started dating, Jason had big plans. He talked about opening his own business, of becoming successful and making a life for themselves that was free of financial struggles. It was an idealistic dream, but it was contagious. She had believed in him then, in his potential, in the passion that drove him forward. And in those early years when they were living in a small but cozy apartment, they both believed that if they worked hard enough, everything would fall into place. There were challenges, of course. Everyone had challenges, but they had faced them together, believing that love, hard work, and determination would see them through. It wasn't until the business venture failed that things began to change. Jason's optimism began to wane, and with it, the man Sarah had fallen in love with. The debt started to pile up. Bills went unpaid, and they were constantly living on the edge. Jason became obsessed with fixing things, finding a way to make money, get ahead, and pay off the mounting debts. It wasn't long before the cracks in their relationship started to show. At first, Sarah tried to support him. She had her own job, a stable one that she used to help cover the costs of their living expenses. But Jason's sense of failure began to consume him. The once bright, hopeful man was now plagued by self-doubt and an unhealthy drive to fix everything, at any cost. She had seen the toll it took on him, on both of them. There were days when she would come home from work to find him sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of bills, his face buried in his hands as he tried to figure out how to make it all work. She could see how desperate he had become, how the pressure of his past mistakes was slowly eating away at him. She remembered the day he came home with the news that he had been offered a loan. It seemed like a lifeline at the time. The money would help him pay off the debts, invest in a new business idea, and finally give them a fresh start. But the loan came with a price, interest rates so high that it was nearly impossible to keep up with the payments. And instead of using the money wisely, Jason made a series of bad decisions. The new business venture failed, and the loan went unpaid, leading to even more debt. It was a spiral, and Sarah watched helplessly as Jason spiraled along with it. Every time they seemed to take one step forward, they ended up taking 2 steps back. She had begged him to ask for help, to be open about their financial struggles, but he refused. Jason had always been the type of person who prided himself on his independence. He didn't want to admit that he couldn't fix everything on his own. It was then that the lies started. Small ones at first. Promises to pay off a bill tomorrow, a claim that everything was under control. But soon those small lies became bigger, and Sarah began to notice the cracks in his stories. His attempts to cover up the truth made her feel isolated, as if she were living with a stranger, someone who was hiding pieces of himself from her. The more Jason withdrew into himself, the more Sarah felt like she was losing him. She tried to reach out, tried to pull him back into the life they had built together, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. He had become a ghost of the man she once knew, and the more he retreated into his own world of guilt and shame, the more the distance between them grew, and then came the arrest. The breaking point. It had come as a shock. Sarah had no idea that Jason had been involved in anything illegal. The news hit her like a thunderclap. Jason, her husband, the man she had stood by through thick and thin, was facing serious criminal charges: fraud, embezzlement, forgery. All the things that she had never imagined he was capable of. That night, after the police had come and gone and the dust had settled, Sarah sat on the couch in a daze. Jason was locked in a jail cell, and she was left to pick up the pieces of a life that felt like it had shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. Everything they had worked for, all the years they had spent together, seemed to hang in the balance. She hadn't known what to do. She still didn't know what to do. Her mind was a blur of fear and disbelief. Jason had made mistakes, big ones. But was he really a criminal? Was he really the person the police had painted him to be? Or was he just a man who had been driven to make desperate choices, someone who had made the wrong decisions in the face of overwhelming pressure? As Sarah sat in the empty apartment, the reality of it all began to set in. She didn't know how to navigate this new reality. She loved Jason, but love wasn't enough to fix everything. The trial loomed large on the horizon, and with it came the overwhelming fear that their lives were about to change forever. She wanted to believe that there was still a chance for him, for them, but the evidence against him seemed so damning. The prosecution had built a strong case. They had witness testimony, financial records, and enough evidence to put Jason away for years. She didn't know how they would survive if he were sent to prison. In those quiet, lonely moments, when Sarah was left alone with her thoughts, the weight of the past seemed unbearable. The mistakes Jason had made, the lies he had told, and the debt they had accumulated, those were the things that had led them here. But what Sarah struggled with the most was not the past itself, but the fear that no matter how much she loved him, no matter how much she wanted to stand by him, it might not be enough. She could feel the crushing weight of the past bearing down on her, threatening to crush everything they had built together. But even as the fear and uncertainty swirled around her, one thing remained clear: she couldn't give up on Jason. Not yet. She just had to find a way to navigate this uncertain future with him, to find a way back to the man she had once known. She wasn't ready to lose him, not without a fight. But in the quiet darkness of the apartment, Sarah knew that the weight of the past wasn't something that could be erased or forgotten. It would follow them, just as it followed Jason, wherever they went, and it would take every ounce of strength she had left to face it. The night stretched on in the quiet apartment, the clock ticking loudly in the stillness, as Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, her thoughts racing. Despite the darkness outside, the weight on her shoulders seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Every question she had, every worry, seemed to swirl in her mind like a storm, and she had no control over its intensity. The trial was only 2 days away, and the uncertainty of it all gnawed at her insides. Sarah's fingers nervously tapped against the armrest, her eyes darting to the phone on the coffee table. She hadn't heard from Jason all evening. He had come home late the night before, and even then, the conversation had been brief, too brief. He seemed so distant, lost in his thoughts, the same way he had been for weeks now. It wasn't just the trial that weighed on him. It was everything. The debts, the past, the life they had been trying to build, all of it was crashing down around them, and he was too proud to ask for help. Sarah knew that, but tonight she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of loneliness. She was standing on the edge, unsure of which way to turn. She had spent so many days trying to hold it together, trying to be the strong one in the relationship. She had always been the one to comfort Jason when things went wrong, the one to pick up the pieces, but now, for the first time, she wasn't sure she could keep it together. She wasn't sure she had the strength left to keep fighting for both of them. Her thoughts drifted back to the brief encounter with Judge Ellison earlier that day. He was the man who would decide Jason's fate in the trial. He was the one who had the power to take everything they had fought for, and crush it with a single decision. And yet, he had looked at her with such understanding, such kindness. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling that there was something more to that meeting than just an ordinary interaction between two strangers. Was it a sign? A sign that maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance. The thought had kept her up for hours the night before, and even now, as she sat in the dimly lit apartment, it wouldn't leave her mind. Was it possible that this one act of kindness, the simple gesture of helping an elderly man with his groceries, could somehow change everything? Her logical side screamed that it was foolish to believe in something so intangible. She couldn't rely on some stranger's kindness to save Jason. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution had built a strong case, and every piece of evidence seemed to point to his guilt. There were witnesses who had seen him manipulate the financial records, people who would testify against him in court. No matter how much Sarah wanted to believe that Judge Ellison would see Jason for who he truly was, a man who had made mistakes, but was not beyond redemption. The reality was harsh. The world didn't work that way. People didn't always get second chances, and sometimes kindness wasn't enough, but then, what if it was? What if this small, seemingly insignificant act of kindness was just the thing that would tip the scales in Jason's favor? The thought lingered in Sarah's mind, refusing to be ignored. She stood up abruptly, the sudden movement breaking the tension that had built up inside her. She needed to do something. She couldn't just sit here and wait for the trial to unfold, feeling helpless and unsure. She had to take action. She had to find some way to make sure that Jason had a chance, no matter how slim, of walking out of that courtroom with his life intact. Sarah walked over to the window and stared out into the dark city. The lights of the street below twinkled, like distant stars, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine a future where everything was okay, a future where Jason was free, where they could rebuild their lives, where they could put the past behind them and move forward together. It was a future that seemed impossible, but she had to hold on to it. She had to believe that it was still within reach. The past few years had been difficult. The pressure of financial struggles, the weight of Jason's mistakes, and the constant uncertainty had worn them both down. But Sarah had never given up on him. She had always believed in Jason, in the man he could be. She had always seen the good in him, even when he couldn't see it in himself. And maybe, just maybe, this was the moment where everything could turn around. She couldn't change the past. She couldn't undo the mistakes that Jason had made, the lies that had been told, the debt that had accumulated. But she could still fight for him. She could still stand by him in this moment, just as she had stood by him through everything else. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to make a difference. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. She picked it up, expecting another message from Emily, who had been checking in on her throughout the day. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. It was a message from Jason. "I'm sorry for being distant. I know I've been shutting you out, but I need you to know I'm doing this for us. I'm going to fight, Sarah. I'm not giving up." A rush of relief washed over her as she read the message. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jason wasn't giving up. He hadn't given up on her, and he hadn't given up on their future. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could make it through this. Maybe they could rebuild their lives piece by piece. She quickly typed a response, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to find the right words. "We're in this together, Jason. I believe in you. We're going to get through this. I'm here for you no matter what." She hit send, her heart pounding in her chest. A few moments later, his reply came through. "Thank you. I needed to hear that. I'm going to do whatever it takes." The simplicity of his words, the sincerity behind them, gave Sarah the strength she needed to carry on. It wasn't over yet. There was still time. The trial was just the beginning of their journey. Whatever happened in that courtroom, they would face it together. They had to. With renewed determination, Sarah took a deep breath and walked over to the small kitchen table where a stack of paperwork lay waiting. She had spent the past few days going over everything she could find related to Jason's case: court transcripts, legal documents, notes from his lawyer. She had done everything she could to prepare for the trial, but there was always more to do. There were always more angles to consider, more ways to fight for the man she loved. As she sat down and began to organize the papers, her mind drifted back to Judge Ellison. He had shown her kindness, but was that enough to sway his decision? Would he be able to see beyond the evidence, beyond the mistakes Jason had made, and see the man he truly was? Sarah didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like there was a chance. Maybe it was small, but it was a chance. And that was enough for now. In the silence of the apartment, with the glow of the kitchen light casting a soft warmth around her, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to Jason. She wasn't going to give up on him. She wasn't going to give up on them. They would face the trial together, and whatever the outcome, they would face it with the same determination that had carried them through the toughest of times. And as Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall, marking the passing of time, she couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the future was still within reach. The glimmer of hope was there, and it was enough to keep her going, no matter what came next. The day of the trial arrived, and Sarah's stomach churned with anxiety. She had barely slept the night before, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, none of them calming. The morning light was harsh and unyielding, spilling through the curtains and reminding her that today would be the most important day of their lives. She had tried to get a good night's sleep, tried to quiet the fears that had kept her tossing and turning, but now that the day was here, she felt an undeniable sense of dread. Jason had already left for the courthouse, leaving before she had even woken up. He had barely said a word as he kissed her on the cheek and told her to stay strong. He hadn't been able to hide the nervousness in his eyes, though, despite the bravado he had tried to put on. Jason was trying so hard to seem confident, but Sarah could see the cracks beneath the surface. She could see the man who had once been full of hope, now standing on the precipice of losing everything he had worked for. She took a deep breath and stood up from the couch. She needed to get ready. She needed to be strong for him, for them. She had to show him that she believed in him, that she was there, even when everything seemed like it was falling apart. The drive to the courthouse felt like an eternity. The streets were busy, the traffic moving at a frustratingly slow pace, as Sarah's thoughts swirled in a haze. She had tried to prepare herself for the worst, but no amount of preparation could have fully prepared her for the weight of the situation. This was not just about Jason. It was about their future. It was about the life they had built together, the plans they had for their future. If Jason was convicted, everything would be turned upside down. Their home, their financial stability, everything was on the line. When she finally arrived at the courthouse, her heart was racing. She walked through the front doors, her mind still filled with doubt and fear, her steps hesitant as if her legs weren't quite ready to carry her through the final stretch. The security at the courthouse was tight. She had to go through metal detectors and show her ID before being allowed inside. Each step felt like she was walking deeper into a world she didn't belong to, a world of legal jargon and decisions that would change the course of her life forever. The hallway leading to the courtroom seemed impossibly long. The echo of footsteps on the marble floors was the only sound that filled the space, and the occasional murmur of voices from other people who were waiting for their own cases to be heard. But for Sarah, nothing else mattered. Nothing else existed in that moment, except for the looming uncertainty of what was about to unfold. She felt as if she were moving in slow motion, each step taking her closer to the inevitable. The door, too. The courtroom swung open, and she stepped inside. The room was cold and imposing, the air thick with tension. The rows of benches were filled with spectators, all looking up at the judge's bench, which stood at the far end of the room. Sarah quickly scanned the room, her eyes landing on Jason, who was sitting beside his lawyer at the defense table. He looked pale, his eyes tired, but still holding a glimmer of something, hope perhaps, or maybe the last remnants of his will to fight. Jason caught her gaze and gave her a small, tight-lipped smile. It was the kind of smile he gave her when he was trying to reassure her, trying to convince her that everything would be fine. But Sarah knew better. She could see the fear in his eyes, the fear that mirrored her own. They both knew how high the stakes were. As Sarah made her way to the empty seat behind the defense table, her mind raced. The prosecutor was already standing, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Sarah recognized him from the pre-trial hearings. He was sharp, confident, and well-prepared. He exuded the kind of authority that made her feel small and powerless, as if he had already decided the outcome of the trial before it even started. Judge Ellison, who had presided over many high-profile cases, entered the courtroom and took his seat at the bench. His presence was commanding, and the room fell silent as everyone stood in respect. Sarah tried to steady her breathing as she took her seat, her hands clenched in her lap. This was it. This was the moment they had been waiting for and fearing together. Judge. Ellison looked down at the papers in front of him, his expression unreadable. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he remembered their brief encounter the day before. Had he noticed her act of kindness? Did it matter? Would it be enough to sway his judgment in Jason's favor? Mr. Parker, Judge Ellison's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone measured and firm. Please rise. Jason stood, his movements slow and deliberate. His lawyer stood beside him, offering him a nod of encouragement. Sarah's heart ached as she watched him, standing there in the stark, unforgiving light of the courtroom. He had never looked more vulnerable than he did now, in that moment. The man she had loved for years, the man who had made so many mistakes, was standing before the judge, his fate hanging in the balance. The prosecutor rose to begin his opening statement. His voice was strong, authoritative, as he laid out the case against Jason. The evidence, he argued, was clear. The fraudulent transactions, the forged signatures, the manipulated financial documents, they all pointed to a man who had broken the law and betrayed the trust of those who had relied on him. The prosecutor painted Jason as a man who had knowingly committed these crimes for personal gain, a man who had used his position of trust to line his own pockets. Sarah could feel the weight of the accusations pressing down on her. Each word felt like a blow, and she could see the effect it had on Jason. His shoulders hunched slightly, his eyes downcast, as if the prosecutor's words were a physical weight he couldn't escape. When the prosecutor finished, Jason's lawyer stood to make his case. Sarah's lawyer was a man she had come to respect in the weeks leading up to the trial. He was experienced, calm under pressure, and seemed to genuinely care about Jason's fate. He spoke of Jason's remorse, his past, mistakes, and his desire to make amends. He painted a picture of a man who had made errors in judgment, but who was not inherently a criminal. He argued that the evidence, while damning, didn't reflect the full story of who Jason was. Sarah listened intently as her lawyer spoke, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see the flicker of hope in Jason's eyes as his lawyer emphasized his good qualities, his work ethic, his dedication to his family, his desire to rebuild his life. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a glimpse of the man she knew Jason could be. A man who was capable of change, of redemption. As the day wore on, the courtroom remained tense. Witnesses were called, evidence presented, and arguments exchanged. Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing as she watched each piece of the puzzle fall into place. The weight of the trial was almost unbearable, and Sarah could feel herself sinking under its pressure. The fear, the anxiety, the uncertainty, it all threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, the time came for the closing arguments. The prosecutor spoke first, reiterating the gravity of the charges and the need for justice to be served. Jason's lawyer followed, urging the judge to consider Jason's character, his remorse, and the possibility of redemption. The fate of Jason's life now rested in the hands of Judge Ellison. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the room fell into an agonizing silence. Judge Ellison nodded, his expression unreadable as he glanced down at the paperwork in front of him. He stood and the room held its breath. "I have heard the arguments, reviewed the evidence, and considered the circumstances surrounding this case," Judge Ellison began, his voice steady and authoritative. "It is clear that Jason Parker has made serious mistakes. However, it is also clear that he is not a man who set out to intentionally harm others. He has shown remorse for his actions, and I believe he deserves a second chance." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the words sank in. Could this be happening? Could this be the moment they had been waiting for? Was the kindness she had shown Judge Ellison enough to sway his judgment? Was there still hope? "As a result," Judge Ellison continued, "I sentence Jason Parker to probation and community service. I trust that he will take this opportunity to rebuild his life." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. The courtroom erupted into a murmur of disbelief and relief. Jason stood there, frozen for a moment, his eyes wide in shock. It wasn't over, but it was a victory. A small one, but a victory nonetheless. Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight lift off her shoulders as she looked at Jason, the man she had always believed in, now given a second chance. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the prosecution prepared to present its case. Sarah felt her heart racing, her palms sweating in the sterile, cold air of the courtroom. She sat in the wooden pew behind Jason, her hands clenched tightly. In her lap, her mind reeling with the weight of what was happening. It felt as if everything in the room was moving in slow motion. Every word the prosecutor spoke, every piece of evidence presented, felt like it was moving further and further away from her grasp, out of her control. Sarah's eyes flickered to Jason, who sat beside his lawyer. His posture was slumped, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes focused on the desk in front of him. There was no sign of the man she had known, the man full of hope and dreams. He was gone, replaced by a shadow of himself, someone who had been stripped of his confidence, his pride, his ability to fight back. He was a man defeated by his own mistakes, standing on the edge of losing everything he had ever worked for. The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp features and a voice that carried authority, stood and approached the center of the courtroom. He was methodical, precise, and exuded an air of confidence that only made Sarah's anxiety worse. Every word he spoke seemed calculated, designed to paint Jason as a criminal, someone who had knowingly deceived, manipulated, and violated the trust of others for his own gain. "We are here today to hold Mr. Jason Parker accountable for his actions," the prosecutor began, his voice commanding attention. "The evidence against him is clear and irrefutable. Mr. Parker has committed a series of financial crimes that have devastated not only his company, but also the people who trusted him." The prosecutor's gaze flickered briefly toward Jason, his words weighted with accusation, before he turned back to face the judge. Sarah's heart tightened as she listened to the opening statement. Each phrase felt like a blow, each word driving the point home that Jason's actions had caused irreversible harm. The prosecutor continued, detailing the charges: fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. He laid out a timeline of Jason's alleged illegal activities, providing detailed accounts of financial transactions and falsified records. Witness testimony was to come, and Sarah knew that the people who would take the stand would do nothing but condemn Jason. Mr. Parker used his position as an accountant to manipulate the company's financial records, falsifying invoices, misappropriating funds, and forging signatures, the prosecutor continued. He did so knowingly, with the intent to deceive, and he profited from these actions at the expense of his employers and the people who relied on him. The evidence is undeniable. Sarah felt the weight of the prosecutor's words settle in her chest. It was one thing to hear about the charges, but hearing them laid out so methodically, so clearly, was something else entirely. The prosecutor made it sound so simple, so final. It wasn't just about the money, though the sums were staggering. It was about trust, integrity, and the betrayal of the people who had believed in Jason. She glanced quickly at Jason. His face had gone pale, and his jaw was clenched tightly. He was desperately trying to keep himself composed, but she could see the tremor in his hand as he gripped the edge of the table. This was more than just a trial. This was the trial of his character, his very identity. It wasn't just about whether he had committed a crime. It was about whether he was a good person, whether he could ever redeem himself from the mistakes of his past. The weight of it seemed to be too much for him to bear. The prosecutor moved forward with the presentation of evidence. The first item was a series of financial records, documents that showed exactly how Jason had allegedly manipulated the company's accounts. A projection on the wall behind the prosecutor displayed various figures, charts, and numbers, each one painting a damning picture of Jason's involvement in the fraudulent activities. There were reports of missing funds, discrepancies in invoices, and falsified signatures that had been traced back to Jason's office. Sarah's stomach churned as she watched the evidence unfold on the screen. She wasn't naive. She knew what was being shown was likely true. The paper trail was hard to dispute and the numbers didn't lie. But as she looked at each document, she couldn't help but wonder, how had it come to this? She had seen Jason struggle over the past few years, but she had never imagined that things could spiral this far out of control. The man she knew was not a criminal. He was a man who had made mistakes, yes, but not one who would intentionally deceive or harm others. This wasn't the person she had fallen in love with. But as the evidence continued to mount, the more it seemed like that was exactly what was being painted, a man capable of betraying not only his employer, but also the people who trusted him. The prosecution's presentation continued with testimonies from witnesses who had worked closely with Jason. The first witness, a former colleague of Jason's, spoke in a tone that was both professional and condemning. The man described how Jason had been responsible for overseeing the company's financial transactions, detailing the specific ways in which Jason had allegedly falsified records and funneled money into private accounts. The witness described feeling shocked when he discovered discrepancies in the books and how he had reported his suspicions to management. He recounted how Jason had tried to cover his tracks by altering spreadsheets and fabricating supporting documents. Sarah's hands began to shake as the witness continued, recounting details that made Jason sound like a seasoned criminal. The more the witness spoke, the more it seemed like Sarah was being pulled into a reality that she couldn't escape. Jason wasn't the person she thought he was. Was he? The next witness, a former client of the company, was equally damning. This person testified about how Jason had forged signatures on important contracts, altering the terms of deals to benefit his own financial interests. The client described feeling misled and betrayed when the truth had come to light. This testimony only added more fuel to the prosecution's case, painting Jason as a man who had used his position of trust to exploit others for personal gain. Sarah's heart ached with each new piece of testimony. It felt like a tidal wave crashing over her, pulling her under with its force. Jason's fate was slipping further and further away from her grasp, and she felt helpless, unable to stop the avalanche of evidence piling up against him. Her thoughts were interrupted by the prosecutor's final remarks. He stood before the judge and addressed the court, his tone unwavering as he called for a severe sentence. He argued that the seriousness of Jason's crimes warranted a harsh punishment, one that would serve as both a deterrent to others and a reflection of the damage done to the victims involved. "We cannot let Mr. Parker's actions go unpunished," the prosecutor said firmly. "He has shown a complete disregard for the law, and he has hurt countless people in the process. The evidence is clear, and it is irrefutable. It is time for him to face the consequences of his actions." As the prosecutor finished his closing remarks, Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. The room felt colder now, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. Jason was facing years in prison. The prosecution had built an airtight case, and Sarah didn't know how they could escape it. She didn't know how they could fight back against the overwhelming evidence that seemed to be closing in on them from every angle. But despite everything, the damning evidence, the testimony, the weight of the charges, Sarah still held on. to one small sliver of hope. Jason wasn't the man the prosecution had painted. He was more than the mistakes he had made, and somehow she had to make sure that Judge Ellison saw that. She wasn't ready to give up on him, not yet. As the prosecutor's case came to a close, a wave of exhaustion washed over Sarah. She felt drained, emotionally and mentally, as she sat in the crowded courtroom, the tension in the air so thick she could almost feel it pressing against her chest. Every word the prosecution had spoken, every piece of evidence presented, felt like another blow to her hope. The case against Jason was strong. It seemed airtight, the kind of case that was impossible to escape. But despite the mounting evidence, despite the damning testimonies, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Jason's story than what had been laid out before them. She knew him. She knew the man who had once been full of dreams, who had once shared a vision for their future. She wasn't going to give up on him now. As the prosecutor took his seat, Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, her hands gripping the edge of the pew. The court was now silent, the heavy weight of the moment hanging in the air like a thick fog. Jason sat beside his lawyer, his face pale and drawn, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Sarah could see the desperation in his eyes. He was trying to stay calm, trying to maintain his composure, but the fear was evident. The fear of what was to come, of the life he might lose, of the possibility that everything he had worked for, everything they had worked for, might slip through his fingers. Then the defense attorney stood. Sarah looked up at him, her gaze fixed on the man who was about to speak on Jason's behalf. Mr. Patel, their lawyer, was a seasoned defense attorney who had been fighting tirelessly for Jason since the beginning of the case. He was calm, methodical, and well-respected. Sarah had trusted him from the very beginning, and she had faith in his ability to present Jason's side of the story. But today, the stakes were higher than ever. Today, it wasn't just about defending Jason's actions. It was about defending his very identity, his very character. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mr. Patel began, his voice calm but unwavering. "What we've heard from the prosecution today is a one-sided narrative. A narrative that paints my client, Mr. Jason Parker, as a man driven by greed and deceit, a man who intentionally harmed those around him for his own gain. But that is not who Jason Parker is. That is not who he has ever been." Sarah sat up straighter, her eyes fixed on Mr. Patel as he continued. His words were a lifeline, a small but steady thread of hope in the storm of doubt and fear that had consumed her. She knew that Mr. Patel had a job to do, but in this moment his words were more than just legal arguments. They were the lifeline she needed to cling to as the trial came to its inevitable climax. "What we've heard today is the prosecution's version of events," Mr. Patel went on, "but it is not the whole truth. Yes, Mr. Parker made mistakes. Yes, he made poor decisions, decisions that, in hindsight, he deeply regrets. But those mistakes were born out of desperation, not malice. They were born out of a man trying to save his business, his livelihood, and the future of his family." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Mr. Patel spoke. She could see it now. This was the heart of the defense. Jason hadn't set out to deceive anyone. He hadn't entered into a life of crime willingly. His mistakes, as painful as they were, had been born out of a sense of desperation, a feeling of being trapped by the weight of mounting debt and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The man she knew had always tried to do the right thing. He wasn't perfect, but he had never meant to hurt anyone. "Mr. Parker's actions were not those of a hardened criminal, Your Honor," Mr. Patel continued, his voice strong and unwavering. "He is not a man who has made a career out of deception or fraud. He is a man who made a series of poor choices, choices that he now regrets deeply, and it is because of those regrets that we are standing here today, asking for understanding, asking for a chance at redemption." Sarah's heart was in her throat as she listened. Mr. Patel was painting a different picture, one that was so much closer to the man she knew, the man she had spent years with. He was speaking to the jury, not just about the actions of the past, but about the potential for change, for growth. He wasn't asking them to ignore the mistakes Jason had made, but he was asking them to see the bigger picture. He was asking them to understand that Jason had learned from those mistakes, that he was more than just his actions. Mr. Patel paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. He turned to the jury, his eyes locking with theirs, his expression intense. "We ask that you look at Mr. Parker not just as the man who made these mistakes, but as the man he is today. A man who is fully aware of the gravity of his actions and is committed to making amends. A man who has shown remorse and who is willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. This is a man who does not belong in prison. This is a man who deserves a second chance." The room fell silent as Mr. Patel finished his statement. Sarah could feel the weight of the words in her chest. For the first time since the trial began, she felt a flicker of hope. She had always known that Jason wasn't a bad person, that he wasn't a criminal at heart. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also shown remorse. He had learned from those mistakes, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. No matter how powerful Mr. Patel's arguments were, the jury had already heard the prosecution's side. They had seen the evidence. They had heard the testimonies of those who had been harmed by Jason's actions. The truth was the prosecution had a strong case, but Sarah knew one thing for certain. Jason was not a man who could be defined by his past alone. He was so much more than the mistakes he had made. Mr. Patel continued, focusing on Jason's character, his history and the actions he had taken to begin making amends. "Mr. Parker has already taken steps to pay back the people he has wronged," he said. "He has worked tirelessly to repair the damage caused by his actions. He has taken on additional work to pay off his debts, and he has sought counseling to deal with the stress that led him down this path. Mr. Parker understands the importance of accountability, and he is ready to face the consequences of his actions. But he does not deserve to lose everything. He deserves a chance to rebuild his life." The defense rested, and the courtroom was quiet once again. Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her. She knew the fight was far from over. There was still the matter of the jury's decision, still the weight of the evidence to contend with. But for the first time since the trial began, she felt like they had a fighting chance. Jason's fate was still uncertain, but with Mr. Patel's words ringing in her ears, Sarah couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the jury would see the man she loved for who he truly was. A man who had made mistakes but was capable of redemption. A man who deserved a second chance. A man who, despite everything, had not given up on the life they had built together. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Judge Ellison stood, his robes flowing slightly as he moved to the center of the room. The air seemed to freeze in anticipation, every eye fixed on the judge as he prepared to deliver his verdict. Sarah's hands were clammy, her heart pounding in her chest. The past few hours had been a whirlwind of arguments, testimonies, and emotional speeches, each one pushing her to the edge of despair, then lifting her with moments of hope. But now, the moment of truth had arrived, and there was no turning back. Jason's fate was about to be sealed. The air in the courtroom was thick, heavy with the weight of the decision about to be made. Sarah glanced at Jason, sitting beside his lawyer, his face pale and tense. He hadn't said much during the trial, too consumed with his thoughts, too lost in the storm of emotions that had engulfed him. He had barely slept in the days leading. Up to this moment, and now, as the time for the verdict approached, she could see the toll it had taken on him. His face was a mask of uncertainty, his fingers gripping the edge of the table tightly, as if trying to hold on to some semblance of control in a world that had spun out of his reach. For a moment, Sarah wished she could take all of the fear and uncertainty from him, wished that she could make everything okay. But she knew that there was nothing she could do now. The decision was in Judge Ellison's hands. It was a moment of finality, and nothing could change it. Judge Ellison's eyes scanned the courtroom, his expression unreadable. He had been silent throughout the closing arguments, his focus intense as he listened carefully to every word. The prosecutor had made his case, presenting a damning argument about Jason's actions and the damage they had caused. The defense had fought back, emphasizing Jason's remorse and his willingness to make amends. Now it was time for the judge to weigh the evidence and decide the fate of the man who had once been a pillar of strength in Sarah's life. For Sarah, the wait felt like an eternity. Her mind raced, flashing between memories of better days, The early days of their relationship, when Jason was full of hope and ambition, before everything had started to unravel. She remembered the man he had been, the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had dreamed of a future they could build together. But now, as the trial unfolded, she saw a different man, a man lost in the consequences of his past actions, struggling to navigate the path back to who he once was. And, yet through it all, Sarah had held on to hope. She had believed, despite everything, that Jason wasn't defined by the mistakes he had made. He was more than the sum of his errors. He was the man who had stood by her through difficult times, the man who had loved her with everything he had. Wasn't that worth something? Didn't he deserve a chance at redemption? Judge Ellison cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, I have carefully reviewed the evidence presented in this case, heard the arguments from both the prosecution and the defense, and considered the character of the defendant, Mr. Jason Parker. It is now time for me to render my decision. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving the judge. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. Mr. Parker, Judge Ellison continued, his voice calm but firm, you have been charged with serious crimes, fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. The evidence against you is compelling, and there is no denying that your actions have caused harm to others. You manipulated financial records, falsified documents, and took advantage of your position for personal gain. These actions are inexcusable, and they have caused damage to your employer, your colleagues, and those who trusted you. Sarah felt a pang in her chest as the judge spoke. She knew the truth of what he was saying. She couldn't deny the facts, couldn't ignore the weight of the evidence. Jason had made mistakes, huge mistakes. He had betrayed the trust of others, and there was no getting around that. But in her heart she knew that Jason wasn't a man who set out to hurt anyone. He had acted out of desperation, driven by the overwhelming pressure of his past mistakes. He wasn't a criminal at his core. Judge Ellison paused for a moment, his gaze moving over the room as if considering the weight of his next words. Then he continued, However, I must also take into account the circumstances surrounding your actions, Mr. Parker. I've heard testimony from both the prosecution and the defense, and it is clear that you deeply regret your actions. You have shown remorse for the harm you caused, and you have taken steps to make amends for your mistakes. You've sought counseling to address the personal issues that led you down this path, and you've worked hard to repay the debts you incurred as a result of your actions. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she listened to the judge's words. There was still a glimmer of hope. The judge wasn't blind to Jason's remorse, to the steps he had taken to turn his life around. Despite the severity of the charges against him, there was recognition of the man he was now, not just the man he had been during the time of his crimes. Judge Ellison looked down at the documents in front of him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Mr. Parker, your actions were a betrayal of trust and they cannot go unpunished. However, I believe that you are not beyond redemption. You have shown a willingness to make things right, to take responsibility for your mistakes, and to rebuild the trust that you have lost. Given these factors, I am not convinced that prison is the appropriate place for you. Sarah's pulse quickened as she tried to process what was happening. Could it be? Could this really be the moment they had been waiting for? Therefore, Judge Ellison continued, I sentence you to probation and mandatory community service. I trust that you will take this opportunity to rebuild your life and demonstrate to the community that you are capable of change. You will also be required to pay restitution to those who have been harmed by your actions. I believe that with time and effort you can earn back the trust that you have lost, but that is your responsibility to prove. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as the judge's words sank in. A second chance. It wasn't a guarantee of freedom, but it was a chance for Jason to prove that he could change, that he could make things right. He wasn't being sentenced to years behind bars, away from her, away from the life they had built together. The full weight that had been pressing down on her heart for so long was slowly beginning to lift, replaced with the beginnings of hope. Jason sat in stunned silence, his eyes wide with disbelief. The gavel struck, and the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Sarah could hardly believe it. The man she loved, her husband, was being given a second chance. He was going to be okay. As the gavel echoed through the room, Sarah stood up and walked toward Jason, her legs shaky but her heart full of relief. He stood as well, his face a mixture of shock, disbelief, and raw emotion. For a moment, they just stared at each other, as if trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, Jason reached for her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "We're going to be okay," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "We have a second chance, Jason. This is just the beginning." Jason nodded against her shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "I won't waste it. I promise." In that moment, Sarah knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There was still so much work to be done, so much to rebuild, but for the first time in a long time, she believed that they could make it through, together. The days that followed the trial were a blur of mixed emotions. Sarah felt as if she were walking through a dream, each step uncertain, but carried by the overwhelming sense of relief that came with Jason's second chance. The weight that had been crushing her chest for weeks, no, for months, was finally lifting. The guilt, the fear, the endless worry that had plagued her, all of it was starting to dissolve, replaced with something she hadn't dared to hope for: optimism. She had her husband back. They had their future. It wasn't easy, of course it wasn't. They both knew that this was just the beginning. The road to redemption was long, and it was full of obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt that they could actually walk it together. Jason's first few days of probation felt surreal. He spent hours at community service sites, volunteering his time to help others. He took on menial tasks, tasks that seemed trivial in the grand scheme of things, but to him they felt like a small way of atoning for what he had done. Every time he finished a shift, his eyes would meet Sarah's with a quiet gratitude. It wasn't just about the work, it was about the feeling of making amends. Jason knew deep down that he had to rebuild more than just his reputation. He had to rebuild himself. And that was what he was doing, 1 hour of service at a time. Sarah watched him closely in these days after the trial. There was something different about him, something that wasn't there before. There was still fear, still an underlying tension as he worked to pay back the people he had wronged. But there was also a new sense of determination, a new resolve that hadn't been there in months. Jason was starting to understand that redemption wasn't something that could be given to him. It was something that had to be earned. And he was willing to do whatever it took. The first time he came home after his community service with a smile on his face, Sarah felt a wave of relief. She had been worried that he would retreat again, that the weight of the past would crush him once more, but Jason wasn't retreating. He was moving forward, one small step at a time. "I don't think I've ever felt more exhausted," Jason admitted one evening, sitting across from Sarah at the kitchen table. The sunlight from the late afternoon filtered through the windows, casting soft shadows across the room. He looked tired, yes, but there was a new spark in his eyes, a new light that Sarah hadn't seen in a long time. "It's a good kind of exhaustion, though," he added, his voice low and steady. "I'm doing something. I'm making things. Right? Even if it's just in small ways for now." Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand over his. His hand was rough, calloused from hours of physical labor, but it was also warm, real. It felt like the Jason she had known, the man she had fallen in love with so many years ago. For a moment she couldn't help but smile, her heart swelling with the hope she had almost given up on. "I'm so proud of you," she said softly. "I know it's hard, but you're doing it. You're proving to yourself and to everyone else that you're capable of change." Jason looked up at her, his gaze unwavering. "I don't know if I can ever make up for everything, Sarah, but I'll spend every day trying." Sarah's heart ached for him. She knew that the guilt still weighed on him heavily. He was trying to make amends, but some things couldn't be undone. The people he had hurt, the trust he had broken. It would take more than community service to fix that. But she also knew that Jason was doing the right thing. He was choosing the hard path, the one that required him to face his past instead of running from it. "I know you will," she said, squeezing his hand, "and I'll be right here, every step of the way. We'll do this together." In the days that followed, Jason's transformation became more and more evident. He began attending counseling sessions, something he had been reluctant to do in the past. He was learning to face the parts of himself that he had been running from for so long, the parts that had led him down this path of mistakes. Every week, after each session, he came home with new insights, new realizations about himself, about how he had allowed fear and pressure to dictate his decisions. But it wasn't just the counseling that was helping him. It was the realization that he wasn't alone, that he had Sarah, and they could rebuild together. Jason's work at the community centers was paying off in other ways too. He began to feel a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He worked with kids, teaching them about accountability and the importance of making the right choices. He cleaned up local parks, worked with organizations that helped those in need. It was a humbling experience, and Jason embraced it. He took pride in every small task, knowing that these were the steps that would eventually lead him to where he needed to be, a better man. One evening, as Sarah watched him pore over some new paperwork for his probation, she couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. It wasn't just about the progress Jason was making, it was about the fact that he was trying. He was fighting for their future, fighting to become the person he had always been capable of being. And in turn, she was fighting too. She was fighting for him, for them, and for the life they had once dreamed of. "I can't believe how much we've been through," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "It feels like we've been living in a storm for so long. But now it's like the clouds are finally starting to clear." Jason looked up at her, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I still feel like there's so much left to fix, Sarah. So much that I can't undo." "You're right," Sarah said. "There's still a lot to fix. But you're doing it. You're doing the work. That's all we can do, right? Take it. One step at a time." Jason nodded slowly, taking in her words. "I'm sorry for everything, for the pain I caused, for the mistakes I made. I don't expect forgiveness right away. I know it will take time, but I'm trying, I'm working on it." Sarah smiled at him, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "You don't need to apologize anymore, Jason. I've already forgiven you, and I know that we'll get through this, together." As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Jason continued on his path to redemption. He worked harder, took on more responsibility, and remained committed to the changes he had promised to make. Sarah, for her part, stood by him every step of the way. She supported him, encouraged him, and reminded him of the man he was beneath the mistakes. Their relationship wasn't perfect, no relationship was, but it was stronger than it had ever been before. They had been through the fire, and together they were emerging stronger, wiser, and more committed to each other than ever. In the end, it wasn't just about Jason's redemption, it was about their redemption. They had both been tested in ways they hadn't imagined, but through it all they had held on to each other, and in that they had found the greatest kind of victory, the victory of love, of second chances, and of the belief that no matter how broken something is, it can always be repaired if you're willing to do the work. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of small but meaningful changes. Life began to settle into a new rhythm, one that was slower, more deliberate, and infused with a sense of purpose that had been lacking for so long. Jason's probation wasn't a free pass. It wasn't a way to erase the past, but it was a second chance. And that was all they needed. It gave them both the space to breathe, to rebuild, and most importantly, to heal. Sarah watched as Jason immersed himself in his work, volunteering countless hours at local charities, community centers, and shelters. At first, it felt like a way for him to do penance, something he had to endure to atone for the mistakes of his past. But gradually, Sarah began to notice a shift. Jason wasn't just doing it because he had to. He was doing it because it made him feel like he was contributing something valuable, like he was making a difference in people's lives. There was something about helping others that started to restore a part of him that had been lost, the part of him that had once believed in his ability to make the world a better place. One afternoon, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her cup of tea cooling in front of her, she watched through the window as Jason worked in the yard, trimming the bushes and clearing away the overgrowth that had begun to take over their small garden. The yard had been one of the last things they'd worked on before the trial had consumed their lives. And now, after everything, Jason was finally getting back to the things that had once brought him peace. The small, mundane tasks that had once seemed unimportant now held a different significance. Every cut of the hedge, every rake of the leaves, felt like a small but necessary step toward a future that no longer seemed so uncertain. Jason paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow, and turned to glance inside. When he saw Sarah, watching him, he smiled, the lines of tension around his eyes softening. It wasn't the smile of a man who had been defeated. It wasn't the smile of someone carrying the weight of guilt or fear anymore. It was the smile of someone who had found, through a lot of hard work, the ability to move forward. "I think we've made a lot of progress, don't you?" Jason called to her from outside, his voice carrying through the open window. Sarah smiled back, feeling a warmth settle deep in her chest. "We've made more than progress, Jason. We've made a new life, one step at a time." Jason chuckled softly, turning his attention back to the yard. "Yeah, I guess we have." His voice was quieter now, almost contemplative. "I can't believe how much has changed. I don't think I ever really understood what it meant to rebuild something, you know? It's not just about fixing the obvious stuff, it's about fixing the things you don't see, the things inside, the parts of yourself that you didn't even realize were broken." Sarah felt her heart swell with emotion at his words. She knew exactly what he meant. Rebuilding wasn't just about the physical things, the house, the yard, the bills. It was about the trust that had been broken, the wounds that had been inflicted on their relationship, and the self-doubt that both of them had carried for so long. It was about facing those things head-on, allowing the time and space for healing, and then deciding to move forward. It was about forgiving, not just each other, but themselves. "You've been doing the hard work, Jason," she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "I've watched you change in ways I didn't think were possible. You're not the same man who walked into that courtroom all those months ago. You're stronger now, and I'm proud of you." Jason stopped what he was doing and looked back at her, his expression earnest. "I didn't think I deserved to hear that," he admitted. "I've spent so much time feeling like I don't deserve any of this. But hearing you say that, well, it makes me feel like maybe I'm not as lost as I thought." Sarah's eyes softened as she stood up and walked toward the door, stepping out into the yard to join him. She stood next to him for a moment, watching, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the garden. It was quiet here, peaceful, just the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. For a long time, the sound of their life together had been drowned out by stress and fear, by the constant tension of living on the edge. But now it was different. There was a stillness, a calmness that she hadn't known they were capable of. "We've come so far," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not over. We have a lot of work left to do. There will be days when it feels hard, days when we want to give up. But as long as we keep going, as long as we keep moving forward together, I know we can handle it." Jason nodded, taking her hand in his. "I know, and I'm ready to keep going. I'm ready to do the work, no matter how long it takes." In the days that followed, they found new ways to rebuild their life together. There was no grand, sweeping moment that defined their new beginning, no instant transformation. It was a slow process, a series of small but significant decisions made every day, each one moving them closer to a future they could be proud of. It was the simple things that mattered: cooking dinner together, sharing long walks, sitting in quiet conversations late at night. There were still challenges, still moments when the weight of the past seemed too heavy to carry. But each time, they faced it together. Each time they reminded themselves that they were not defined by their mistakes, but by their willingness to move forward, to forgive, and to grow. Jason's probation continued, but with each passing month it became less of a burden and more of a reminder of how far they had come. He worked tirelessly to pay off the restitution, to rebuild the trust he had lost. He attended every meeting, every counseling session, and never once wavered in his commitment to becoming the man Sarah knew he could be. And Sarah was there every step of the way, her support unwavering, her belief in him growing stronger with each passing day. They also began to dream again. They had been so caught up in survival mode for so long that they had forgotten how to envision a future beyond. The next hurdle. But now, with the weight of the past finally starting to lift, they allowed themselves to imagine a life together, one that wasn't marked by mistakes or regret, but by the possibility of something better. They talked about their future, about their goals, their hopes. Sarah dreamed of traveling again, of seeing the world with Jason by her side. Jason talked about starting a new business, one that would reflect the lessons he had learned, the importance of honesty, of integrity, of building something that mattered. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset and the sky turn shades of pink and gold, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. This was their life now. This was the new beginning they had fought for. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And in that moment, that was enough. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Sarah said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. Jason squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the same quiet determination that had carried them through the hardest parts of their journey. "We've just started," he said, his voice full of hope. "But together, we can handle anything." And in that moment, Sarah knew that their love, tested, bruised, but never broken, would carry them through whatever came next. They had a future now. A future they would build together, one day at a time.